What we're going to focus on in the next panel is to broaden the horizon slightly. This morning has been primarily, but not exclusively, looking at the UK and the situation here around decarbonisation. But what we want to do with this panel is broaden it and looking what's happening in Europe and also in the US. So I'm delighted that we have on our panel today John Bozzella, who's the President and CEO of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, and Maria Linkova-Nijs, Executive Head of Policy and Strategy at ACEA. They're going to say a few words on video whilst they walk to the stage.
In the US, we always knew that the EV transition would be choppy. We do expect EV sales to continue to grow over the near term, but at a slower pace.
The European automotive industry continues to invest billions into this transformation, but the challenge remains. The pace set by the legislators no longer matches the current market realities.
Okay, it may be we're going to have a breakout of total agreement between the three of us, but every time we have this event, we always seem to be turning up in turbulent times. So perhaps unsurprising, John, I'm going to start with you. What's going on now with the transition to EVs in the US? Do you have any sense of stability?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So the simple answer is no, if the question is stability. But let's unpack it a bit. And by the way, thanks for having me, Mike, and a great successful conference, so congratulations. Here's what's happening sort of in the US, right? We have this sort of, people in the US might call it a case of regulatory whiplash, right? Where we go from one extreme regulatory and policy framework, say in the Biden administration, very pro-EV, aggressive mandate-like EV strategy, to a Trump strategy, which is, really in essence an absence of greenhouse gas regulation for cars and light trucks. And so that's why the short answer is there's a high degree of uncertainty. But really what's happening in the marketplace is in 2025, the market was about, 10% at the beginning, and then you saw, again, good growth as we'd seen for the last 4 or 5 years. And then as the US Congress pulled back on very powerful federally funded incentives for the purchase of EVs, there was this massive pre-buy. And so you had this big spike of growth in the fall. And then sort of November, December, the drop, right? Because all of those sales were pulled forward. And so we ended the year at about 9.5% of EV sales as a percentage of overall sales. But sort of free demand, absent government policy and regulation, is probably in the 6.5% to 7% range. And what we're going to see, though, is growth on top of that. We can get into why I believe there will be continued growth in the EV market in the US, but we can hold that for later.
And you've described that regulatory whiplash. And if you were to look, there's midterms this year. Obviously, you have fixed 4-year terms. If you were looking in the medium term, do you see an end to that whiplash, or will it just whip back the other way?
Yeah, that's one of the great fundamental questions of our, not only within the industry, but really in many ways about our political system. Certainly, the ambition of the industry in the U.S. is to plot a middle course. We have always supported regulation that continues improvement in emissions reductions, that supports technology investments, and that balances those goals with remaining globally competitive as an industrial base in the United States. And so, our ambition is to get that balance right and get sort of in between, in the middle of the field. And so elections do have consequences. And so what we'd like to see is maybe the swings are a little bit less aggressive.
And Maria, looking at the EU, the EU has long been a proponent of this shift towards decarbonisation. Prior to Brexit, the UK followed EU regulation. But given what's been announced in the last few weeks, months, it sounds like it's crossed the Rubicon in terms of those fixed dates look like they have some sort of flexibility now.
Yes, so first of all, for those of you who don't know ACEA, so we represent Europe's 17 major manufacturers of cars, vans, trucks and buses. To respond to your question, obviously we need to understand where the market stands. The market is growing, but just not at the pace required by the legislator. And I already told Mike earlier today that I can just copy-paste most of his speech that he delivered this morning also to describe the situation that we are in Europe. For passenger car market in 2025, we've got 17% market share for BEVs. Vans are in a very difficult situation. So the overall market has shrunk significantly, and also the registrations of new battery electric vans have barely climbed 10%. So, and trucks represent 4% of the new registrations. So it's clear that the current 2030, 2035 targets cannot be achieved, and we need a much more pragmatic and flexible pathway. Again, investments have been made and will continue to be made. No one is asking for any U-turn, but simply a more manageable pace of this transformation, and also what we call a three-lane approach. So we clearly see that different vehicle segments do not follow the same trajectory, and therefore they all need specific, separate targets, but also policy incentives and policy approaches. And that's the message that ACEA have been communicating to European policymakers over the past few years. And what we see as a result, in December last year, the European Commission published a proposal for an amended regulation setting CO2 standards. However, what has been proposed, it's a good step forward, but still not enough in light of the current market realities.
And speaking of those market realities, obviously the EU is 27 member states and other European countries follow that. Do you see a consistent pattern across Europe, or is there an East v West, North v South divide?
Yeah, so it's a very, I have a very brilliant graph, which basically, if you look at it, you clearly see that there are three clusters of countries. So this transition is also very uneven. So you've got a cluster of countries like Denmark, like the Netherlands, where the registrations of battery electric vehicles are surpassing 40, 50%, even more than that. You've got countries in the middle, like France and Germany, but most of the, say, Central, Eastern, Southern Europe is in the cluster number 3, and there the registrations, again, barely surpass 10% of the market. So we're also looking at a very uneven transformation, and of course, to ensure that targets are met and the CO2 is reduced, we also need to have all countries on board and not just, let's say, the group of the most affluent ones.
Now, the UK is a fairly homogenous market, but the US famously isn't, and California in particular tends to push very fast in favour of decarbonisation and air quality issues. Where are we on carbon and everything else, and the role of states and California in particular in regulatory settings?
Yeah. Well, sir, first, let me talk about California as a car market, and then let's talk about California as a regulator. Because I think Maria said something very important, which is, customers, there's a diversity across Europe, which it's not just a diversity of policy and regulation, but of customers and use cases, right? This is, of course, true in the United States. You see higher levels of EV sales on the coasts. Certainly in the good weather parts of the East and predominantly in the West Coast. So, so some of some of what California has is favorable conditions, also strong, high level of income earners. So a lot of money. Now, California also has a unique set of environmental challenges. Air pollution. If you've ever been to Los Angeles, you know it sits in a basin, and you got the Pacific Ocean, and you got the mountains, and criteria pollutant emissions, I'm distinguishing those from greenhouse gas emissions, sit in that basin. And so since the late 50s and early 60s, California has been trying to deal with that. And so California has had a leading role in reducing criteria pollutant emissions from cars and light trucks and medium and heavy duty trucks for quite some time. I don't think that role will change, and that role is enshrined in our national law called the Clean Air Act. What's open for debate, interpretation, and maybe a Supreme Court decision is California's role as a greenhouse gas regulator. California, as I'm sure this audience is quite well aware, had in place I would call it a California style here, you might call it a UK style mandate, where by 2035, internal combustion engines were going to be banned. This was the bridge too far for American consumers, and it had the effect of, in my view, politicizing EVs. There's nothing inherently political about that device, just like there isn't anything inherently political about your iPhone or your whatever smartphone you carry. But the idea that the government will tell you you can only buy this and you can't buy that created a groundswell of concern that led Congress to actually prevent California from continuing with that program. And so now California has to think differently about how it can regulate greenhouse gases and how it can drive EV adoption into the future. One last point on California. I think I sound critical of California, perhaps, but I want to commend them also. California has, for many, many years, put its money where its mouth is. It leads U.S. investments in infrastructure, charging infrastructure, consumer awareness programs, and focuses holistically. We heard some commentary earlier today. Hey, we need an all-of-government approach when we think about electrification. California kind of does that. It was the overreach that really, the mandate and the ban that really, sort of changed the dynamics. So I think the greenhouse gas question for California is still open, and we'll see how that plays out, primarily in the model years starting in probably 2030 and beyond.
Okay. You sound, the way you describe it, it sounds like you said the regulators overreach the consumer. Maria, do you sense that regulators actually understand the impact of these decisions around decarbonisation, both on the consumer and the industry, or is it, famously what we often describe policy making as it comes from an ivory tower? It's not vested in either economic or social reality.
Well, that's, I think, now the data speaks for itself, and indeed, I think we hear and see that everyone also knows that the market is simply not there, it's not performing. There is a strong realization of that in a lot of EU member states, national governments that also called on the Commission to support a more flexible, pragmatic approach. However, there's always, of course, a dilemma that I think also you're struggling here with in the UK. So how to keep the trajectory without making any abrupt changes that, of course, also spook investors, but still allow for a sufficient degree of flexibility for manufacturers to be able to avoid penalties in case the market does not perform. So I think that's the also why we as ACEA, we're not calling, for example, from 2030 targets for European OEMs, minus 55% reduction target. We're not calling for any change in the target, but we're saying give us more flexibility to achieve it, have a 5-year averaging approach to ensure that then some manufacturers can exceed those targets and then overcompensate it later on. That again gives that required flexibility. So that's, I think, the message that is maybe more subtle or more nuanced and maybe not that easy to grasp for everyone, but I think that is now starting to get traction also in Brussels.
But do you think they actually understand the cost to industry of this transition, in the face of global threats, or is it just basically we're keeping our line or make a slight bit of deviation to try and accommodate particular requests?
Again, depends on who you speak to. Obviously, it's part of the EU. We have to somehow make an agreement with 27 member states, also with different agendas sometimes. But indeed, I think this whole transition has shown to everyone that this is not just about climate targets. It's a discussion about competitiveness, industrial strategy. It's a discussion about how to get access to critical raw materials. It's a discussion about how to build a battery value chain in Europe whilst we have energy costs twice as high as in the United States and China. It's about how to actually grow the overall market, because the market has been shrinking. We're missing 3 million vehicles on the roads in the EU compared to pre-COVID times, and people keep to their vehicles longer. So it's a really a very complex issue. It's not just about climate targets, so it's competitiveness, industrial strategy, resilience, trade and international relations. I'm sure you're going to ask me about Industrial Accelerator Act.
You know what's coming next.
So, so that's the problem that indeed does not have maybe a very clear-cut solution also for the regulator.
Yeah, and yes, you did provide me with the perfect segue when I could not ask this question. Obviously, the announcement of the Industrial Accelerator Act, the Made in Europe provisions, ACEA has been quiet and it hasn't come out one way or the other. Now, is that because of the complexity of the regulation, the conflict that seems to be in the regulation, or are members particularly split on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think complexity is definitely the word that we use now to describe this. Just yesterday, I spent a couple of hours with also our members trying to list the questions that we all have about this piece of legislation that first need to be answered and understood before we even can make up our minds. And that is, so that's why for the time being we don't have any set position, but it's just again a question whether this complex piece of legislation that comes at a time where we're already struggling with so many challenges, will it provide incentives to increase manufacturing in Europe, or will it only add additional costs, for vehicles and therefore make vehicles less affordable and even slow down the transformation? So we don't have, I think, the answer yet, but I think that should be probably the main point also for us as an industry to before we make a position on that.
Yeah. And you raise a good point about competitiveness, and obviously leads to that question about who is the most competitive. Now, John, if I was to ask you in terms of we are globally seeing increasing protectionism, and that tends to mitigate against innovation. Do you see other regions, and especially with the Trump administration rolling right back on EVs, do you see other regions, other countries in particular, stealing a march in this, both in terms of innovation and ultimately deployment globally?
Yeah, look, this is the big question, right? What does it mean to be globally competitive as an auto industry in the US or in Europe or in the UK vis-a-vis China, right? That's the big question. There's a lot of elements to this question, but let's stay focused since we're at an electrification conference. Just talk about electrification for a second. In the US, if we're not careful, we end up with what, I've called a number of times publicly the Goldilocks problem. And so if you know the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, right? Too small, too big, just right, too hot, too cold, just right. There's a potential Goldilocks problem that the US has with regard to electrification. If you go too fast, China wins. How do we know? I'm here. I'm here in the UK. I go to Europe. I go to Mexico. Like, I can see what's happening in those markets. If you go too slow, China wins, right? You lose your capacity to innovate and compete. In the US, we make a lot of vehicles, millions and millions of vehicles for customers in the US. But, probably make, I don't know, 11 million vehicles. We export 2 million vehicles to countries around the world. That's important. That's a six assembly plants worth of US production and Americans working in states around the country. So we do need to remain competitive. And so we've got to find, that's why I keep coming back to this middle ground idea. And frankly, it is, and I totally agree with Maria on this is more a conversation about competitiveness than it is a conversation about emissions. And so getting the balance right is absolutely essential.
Absolutely. If there are any questions from the floor, please raise your hand. We've got a few minutes left. As always, it's almost impossible to see anyone out there, but jump up and down or scream out or something. Erin in what is now seems to be almost the front row.
It's like church.
The front pew.
At least our church.
Well, Jenny's gone, so I can ask all the questions. It's a question for both of you. Everyone today has been talking about we've got to slow down electrification targets to go at the rate that the consumer's going at, the consumer's not there. And that's led to a lot of narratives around production, sales, volumes, pricing, and so on. No one's talked about marketing, PR, advertising, communications. I would pick up on that because I'm a journalist, but I think it is supremely important that if the consumer is going to come with us on a journey that, by our own admission, across the board, whichever market you're in, we've got to now divert from the original plan, and we've got to soften targets, and we've got to ask the government to give us a bit more time, and so on. Will it be 2030? Will it be 2035? Any deviation from what we as journalists have told the consumer is happening just makes the consumer think it's not happening. Oh, there's no need. I won't go electric because obviously it's not happening. It's like diesel all over again. Do you think that, as well as OEMs and retailers having to do a big communications and marketing and PR job, it's incumbent upon governments in each market to do a public information campaign? John, you mentioned California, that, surely it's a key part of the strategy. We can't forget the comms.
Yeah.
You go first.
I'll jump in first. That's okay, Maria. So it's a great question. It's a great point. It's been said a number of times today. The customer's got to be along for the ride. Like, everything starts with the customer. The customer is in control. I grew up in the industry. I worked at Ford Motor Company. I worked at what is now Stellantis. So I was always taught you start with the customer and you work backwards. So there has to be communication, there has to be engagement, there has to be an understanding of the marketplace. By the way, going to the regulatory push also has terrible message consequences. If we have to ban internal combustion engines and leave people with only one choice, you have a potential distressed goods problem on your hands. So you have to be thoughtful all the way around how government communicates its policies, and especially how we as an industry talk about this. So you're right, we're almost, it feels like we're in a family conversation, we're talking a little bit of shop, but your point is well taken. What I see in the United States, however, is heartening. The loyalty, the EV owner loyalty numbers are off the charts. People in the United States who get into EVs don't get out of them. That's a great story. We constantly want to continue to tell that story. These are great products, and they're fun to drive for all the reasons you all know about. And so, yes, we have to continue to reinforce that message. And when we get into that message, then it becomes less a discussion about politics and more a discussion about, is this the right thing for me? Is this a great way to get from point A to point B? Is this the right, choice for my family? So I think if we can, I think the regulatory dynamics complicate the message. And I think we have to make sure that we're focused as an industry on talking to the customer. So I agree with you.
Maria?
Yeah. Well, I might sound a little bit contrarian, but I think no amount of marketing will help if there is no work on the enabling framework, right? If the costs of charging a vehicle were minimal, if there was infrastructure everywhere that it was super convenient for everyone to charge their vehicles, would people be wondering, do I buy EV or do I buy something else? No, that would be a no-brainer for them to say, of course, yes, I'm going to buy EV because I'm going to save money, or if I own a van for my business that will help me save costs for my business. So for me, it's not a marketing problem, but it's rather the enabling framework problem. Wherever I go, in all the showrooms in all the countries, you see EVs everywhere or plug-in hybrids. It's not that they are hidden somewhere in the warehouse and consumers only see ICE vehicles, but clearly still people don't choose them for various reasons that we also heard about. And I think we should work on those, of course, in addition to marketing and communication, but to me, it's not a marketing problem.
Yeah, can I just build, because I think Maria is exactly right. I mean, in the US, until, it's probably still true today, but less true. So as sales were growing at significant year-over-year percentage rates, sales of new vehicles were consistently outpacing the installation of publicly available charging infrastructure. Getting from 0% to 10% was easy in the US. Getting from 10% to 15, 16, 17% is really difficult. Why? Because we're done with the early adopters and we're done with the easy adopters. And so this is your point exactly. And so I can't solve through marketing the problem of a single car family living in an apartment building. That person has very limited EV choices right now, primarily because of infrastructure. So like that's what I meant in my video when I said growth is inevitably going to be choppy. You're going to get to a plateau. You're going to have to build out other things have to happen to continue that growth. So it's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think no one was, you're right, no one was worried about the first 10%. You're worried about the last 10, 20, 30%, yes. The harder to decarbonize locations. Right. I am getting flashed at to wrap up, but like,
aren't you the boss?
But it's my party. I'll keep the bar open. But a final question to you both, and it's not about what you want to drink. That comes later. We focused a lot on regulation, but if you had that single ask of government, what single measure would help accelerate decarbonisation? Whether it's regulation, whether it's incentives, whether it's communication, whether it's competitiveness issues, what would be the one thing you would ask of your respective administrations? John, you go first.
Yeah, so a 360-degree view of the industry. So in the US, we look at a car as an emissions device by one agency. Over here, we look at it as a transportation device. What we need is an approach that sees the industry as critical to our economic way of life in the United States, but also important to our national security. So 360-degree view, critical minerals, resilient supply chains, partnerships with our trading partners. Those types of policies, I think, are critically important going forward.
Right.
I'll be quick. Consistent demand incentives and just simply giving us more flexibility to just buy more time to develop vehicles and shield us from the risk of non-compliance, the risk of penalties, whilst we're still trying to completely change the way we build vehicles.
Well, obviously, at risk of answering my own question, I think you can guess what our particular ask would be of this government after listening to the sessions this morning. It does concern the mandate, and it's about a review. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking both John and Maria for their time today.